The northern wind carried no warmth. It had not carried warmth for many years, not since the kingdom of Angmar fell and its lord fled south to darker fortresses. The ruins of Carn Dûm stood silent against the empty sky stones, blackened by old fire's walls that once rang with the commands of the Witch King, now home only to ice and memory. But on this night, the silence broke. The sky tore. Not with thunder or the crack of storm, but with a sound like iron grinding against iron, a wrongness that made the very air recoil. The stars dimmed as if afraid to witness what came next. From the wound in reality, cold poured forth, not the honest cold of winter, but something older, more absolute. It was the cold of endings, of cessation itself, made manifest. Through the rift stepped a figure clad in armor of dark metal, each plate rimmed with frost that never melted. His tread upon the frozen earth made no sound. Yet the ground beneath him seemed distilled to quiet, as though the stone itself held its breath. Where he walked, the temperature fell. Moisture froze in the air. The wind died mid-gust. He surveyed the ruins with eyes that burned pale blue. From within the shadows of his helm, twin points of frozen light that held no warmth, no mercy, no doubt. His right hand rested on the hilt of a great blade, its surface dark as a moonless night, its edge etched with patterns that hurt to perceive. The sword hummed with a hunger that went beyond mere desire for blood. It thirsted for something deeper. Behind him, the citadel began to rise. Ice did not simply form. It built itself layer upon layer, responding to an unseen will that demanded structure where chaos had reigned. Towers of black ice thrust upward from the ruins, their surfaces smooth and angular, free of ornamentation. They were not beautiful. They were correct. Each angle served a purpose. Each wall stood exactly where it must. The fortress took shape not as a dwelling, but as a mechanism, a tool forged for one singular function: control. The armored figure ascended steps that materialized beneath his boots, each one precise, each one inevitable. At the summit, a throne waited, carved from a single mass of glacial ice so clear it seemed to contain depths without end. He settled onto it without ceremony, without triumph. This was not a conquest. It was an installation. "Silence," he said. His voice carried neither anger nor passion. It simply was flat and final, as a tombstone's epitaph. Around Carn Dûm, the wind ceased entirely. Birds that had been roosting on distant cliffs fell from their perches, not dead, but gripped by a terror too profound for motion. In the valleys below, wolves stopped mid-howl. The land itself seemed to draw inward, to shrink from the presence that had claimed this place. From his throne, the Lich King extended his will outward, like roots seeking purchase in frozen soil. He did not announce himself. He did not proclaim conquest or make demands. He simply began the work, methodical and patient, as a craftsman, organizing his tools. The dead lands of Angmar would serve again, not under the banner of fear that the Witch King once wielded, but under something far more terrible: order. South of the ruins in the rolling downs, where the ancient kings of Cardolan lay, buried, the Barrow-wights stirred. These had been men once long ago, before the Witch King sent spirits to inhabit their tombs and corrupt their rest. For centuries they had dwelt in malice, luring travelers into the dark mounds, claiming victims for a purpose they had long forgotten. They were hatred, given form, malevolence without goal. Now in the depth of their earthen chambers, they felt something new pressed down upon them. It was not fear, for they knew nothing of fear anymore. It was pressure immense and inescapable, as though the weight of mountains had been concentrated into a single point of consciousness, bearing down upon their existence. The Lich King did not travel to the Barrow Downs. He had no need. His power moved through channels invisible to mortal perception, flowing along the pathways where death held dominion. In the darkness of the Barrows, the Whites found their ancient autonomy stripped away. They were no longer independent malice. They were components, parts of a greater system, and the system was waking. Beneath the earth, bones began to shift. Not randomly, not with the jerking madness of awakening corpses, but with precision. Skeletal hands arranged themselves into formation. Skulls turned in unison. The dead of Cardolan rose, and they rose in rows. No screams accompanied their return, no moans or wails of torment. They simply stood awaiting instruction, empty sockets fixed forward with the discipline of soldiers on parade. The Whites that had animated them found themselves reduced, their individual will, subsumed into a network that demanded perfect coordination. They were no longer haunters of lonely tombs. They were infrastructure. Above ground on the paths that wound between the barrows, a patrol of rangers noticed the change first. These were Dunedain descendants of the northern kings who kept watch over the wild lands between the Shire and the ruins of their lost realm. They knew the Barrow Downs, knew the danger that lurked in those ancient mounds. They had learned to give the place distance to mark its boundaries and warn travelers away. But as dawn broke thin and gray over the downs, one of the rangers, a weathered tracker named Baranor, pulled his cloak tighter and frowned at the horizon. "Something's wrong," he said to his companion. The other ranger, younger, looked at him questioningly. "The Barrows. They're always wrong. Not like this." Baranor's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "Listen." The younger man did. For a moment he heard nothing unusual, the rustle of dry grass, the distant cry of a crow. Then he understood. That was all he heard. The Barrow Downs had always carried a weight of wrongness, a heaviness in the air that made men's skin crawl. But now there was something else. A stillness that felt organized, deliberate. "We need to report this," Baranor said quietly. "Something's changed in the north, and I don't think it's finished changing yet." They turned their horses south, riding hard toward Rivendell, unaware that the message they carried would reach ears that had heard the music of creation itself and would still find this news troubling beyond measure. In the last homely house, Elrond half-elven sat in his library, a tome of ancient genealogies open before him. The work of preserving knowledge never ceased, even as the world aged and memory grew dim. He was recording the lineage of a family from Arnor, tracing their descent through generations, when the weight of unease settled upon him like a cold hand on his shoulder. He looked up from his work, his gaze distant, reaching out with senses that could perceive currents invisible to mortal eyes. Something was moving in the north, something that did not belong to the patterns he had studied for 3 ages of the world. It was not the creeping shadow of Mordor, not the gradual corruption that Sauron spread through lies and manipulation. This was different. This was immediate, surgical, mechanical. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, swift and sure. A moment later, Gandalf the Grey entered without ceremony, his staff tapping sharply against the stone floor. His face was grim beneath the brim of his pointed hat, his eyes troubled. "You feel it," Elrond said. It was not a question. "I feel something," Gandalf replied, moving to the window that overlooked the valley. "A disturbance in the north. The Rangers bring word of changes in the Barrow Downs. The Whites have gone quiet, but it's not the quiet of absence. It's the quiet of order." Elrond closed his book with deliberate care. "Order," he repeated slowly, tasting the word. "That is not the nature of those places. The barrows are chaos-bound to malice remnants of the Witch King's work. Gandalf corrected. Something has come to Angmar Elrond. Something that treats chaos as a problem to be solved. He turned from the window, and his expression was one Elrond had seldom seen on his friend's face, uncertainty bordering on confusion. Sauron seeks to dominate through corruption, to bend wills and twist hearts. This is not that. This is not corruption. This is replacement. You speak as though the dead have found a new master. I speak as though they've found a new purpose, Gandalf said. Or rather, as though purpose has found them. The distinction troubles me. Elrond rose from his seat, moving to stand beside the wizard. Together they looked north toward lands that had been empty of hope for 1,000 years. If not Sauron's work, then whose? That king, Gandalf said quietly, is what frightens me most. I do not know. But I feel it, Elrond, two shadows now darken this world. One we have prepared to fight for an age. The other, he trailed off his knuckles white where they gripped his staff. The other does not ask for surrender. It does not offer terms or seek converts. It simply is, and it expects all else to cease being. Gandalf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There are forms of darkness that need the living to feed upon, and there are forms that have no need of the living at all. Elrond felt the chill of those words settle deep in his bones. I will send word to the Rangers. Double the patrols. Map the extent of this change. Do so, Gandalf agreed. But prepare yourself, old friend. I fear the war we expected is about to become far more complicated. He paused at the doorway. And pray we do not find ourselves fighting on two fronts against enemies who see each other as rivals. Long after the wizard departed, Elrond remained at the window watching the northern horizon. The sky above Angmar had taken on a quality he could not name, not darker, but somehow emptier, as though light itself had begun to drain away. He thought of the ages he had witnessed, the wars he had survived, the sorrows he had endured. Yet this felt different from all that had come before. This felt like the beginning of something that did not know how to end. Far to the east, beyond the misty mountains and the brown lands beyond, even the dead marshes where the faces of the slain stared up through murky waters. The dark tower of Barad-dûr thrust upward into the sky like a sword of iron pointed at the heavens. Within its highest chamber, where no light entered save the red glow of furnaces far below, a presence stirred. Sauron did not possess a body as mortals understood such things. What remained of him was will vast and patient, held together by the power he had poured into a simple band of gold. But will alone was enough. Will could perceive. Will could plan. And will could feel when something touched what belonged to it. One of the Nazgûl, a wraith whose name had been forgotten even by himself, knelt in the chamber's center. Its form was barely visible, a darker shadow, within the darkness draped in tattered robes that had once been royal garments. It had flown north at its master's command, seeking to understand the reports that had filtered back through lesser servants. Whispers of change of silence spreading of the dead, moving with purpose they had not shown before. "Speak!" came the command, and though no voice sounded, every stone in the tower seemed to vibrate with the weight of that single word. The Nazgûl's response was not in words, but in images, in sensations shared through the bond that shackled it to its master. Carn Dûm rebuilt in black ice. The Barrow Downs transformed into something that resembled a military installation more than a haunted burial ground. And most troubling, a presence cold beyond measure, patient beyond reason, organized beyond any force the Wraith had encountered in its millennia of service. When something touched the edge of the Nazgul's perception, something that pulled at its very essence the way a fisherman might test a line, the Wraith had fled. It had not chosen to flee. Choice had been stripped from the Nazgul long ago. But the bond that tied it to Sauron had jerked it back like a dog on a chain sensing danger in that alien pull. For a long moment, silence filled the chamber. Then slowly, Sauron's will condensed into something that might have been amusement, if such an entity could still feel amusement. "Someone is touching what belongs to me," the Dark Lord observed, and the walls themselves seemed to lean inward as if eager to hear. How interesting. The Nazgul remained kneeling, its presence flickering with an emotion that might have been fear, though. Fear, too, had been hollowed out of it long ago, leaving only the echo of the sensation. This one thinks to claim the dead. Sauron continued his thought, rolling through the tower like distant thunder. This one believes organization is power, that structure is control. This one does not yet understand that I have had 3,000 years to weave my threads into the fabric of this world. A pause heavy with consideration. But it is strong. Crude, direct, but strong. The Nazgul waited, trembling slightly despite having no flesh to tremble. I will not act hastily, Sauron decided. Let this new player expend itself against the chaos it seeks to tame. Let it draw attention, let it make itself visible. The free peoples will exhaust themselves fighting this new threat, and when both are weakened, the thought trailed off into satisfaction. Yes, let the Northlands freeze. Let the dead march. It serves my purpose. For now. The dismissal was clear, and the Nazgul fled the chamber with something approaching relief. Behind it, in the darkness of the highest room, a Barad-dûr Sauron's will turned inward, calculating, planning, patient, as stone wearing down beneath water. He had built an empire on patience. He had conquered through time itself, through the slow binding of wills and the gradual corruption of hope. This new element, this force from beyond, was powerful but unsubtle. It would burn bright and draw the eye, and while all eyes looked north, the true work would continue in shadow. But even as Sauron's thoughts moved to other matters, the movements of his armies, the placement of his spies, the slow turning of his great plan, a small part of his vast consciousness remained fixed on the north. Watching, waiting. And despite 3,000 years of patience, despite power that had brought kingdoms to ruin and made the very name of Mordor a curse upon mortal tongues, Sauron found himself experiencing something he had not felt in many long centuries. Curiosity. And beneath it, buried so deep that even he barely acknowledged it, the faintest thread of concern. For the first time since he had forged the One Ring and bound the world to his will, Sauron was not the only power that understood how to hold other beings in absolute dominion. The game had changed, though most of the pieces did not yet know they were playing. In the cold halls of the Ice Citadel, the Lich King sat motionless upon his throne. He did not sleep. He did not dream. He simply existed, his mind extending through the network of undead that spread outward from Carn Dûm like roots from a great tree. Each skeleton, each wight, each risen corpse was a node in his consciousness, a point of perception through which he could observe and direct. He had felt the presence that had touched his work in the Barrow Downs, felt it pull at one of the wights, testing its bonds, trying to understand what now held it. The pull had been strong, backed by ancient power and terrible will. But the Lich King's grip was stronger. He had claimed these dead not through corruption or slow manipulation, but through direct override, through the imposition of his will so absolute that it left no room for doubt or resistance. The entity in the East, the one whose power tasted of rings and binding and patient malice, that one was skilled. That one understood control, understood the long game, the slow conquest. But that one did not understand what the Lich King understood. What he had learned through his own damnation. That the dead did not need to be convinced. They simply needed to be claimed. "You have built your empire on chains," the Lich King said to the empty hall, his words cold as the void between stars. "I am building mine on silence." He raised one gauntleted hand, and throughout the northern lands the network responded. Undead turned in unison. Whites adjusted their formations. From the ruins of Fornost to the desolate stretches of the lone lands, the machinery of death continued its work, methodical and inexorable. Two powers now vied for dominion over the dead of Middle-earth. One ancient patient bound to the world, through the power of a ring forged in fire. The other foreign immediate tied to nothing but its own implacable will. The world between them had not yet realized it was the prize. But it would. Soon all would understand what it meant when the frozen sovereign reached for what the Dark Lord claimed as his own. And in that understanding, in that moment of recognition, the true nature of their conflict would be revealed. Not a war of armies, not a clash of ideologies, but something simpler and more terrible, a dispute over ownership. The Nazgul that flew north was not the Witch King. Sauron had not yet committed his greatest servant to this investigation. This was a lesser wraith, one whose name had been lost to time, whose mortal achievements meant nothing now. It had been a king once, perhaps, or a sorcerer. The distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was that it could fly, could perceive what living eyes could not, and most importantly, it was expendable. The creature rode the night wind on wings of shadow and terror. Its mount a fell beast, whose leathery pinions beat the air with rhythmic precision. Below the lands of Eriador, spread out in darkness the weather hills, the remnants of ancient watchtowers, the lonely paths where rangers kept their endless vigil. The wraith paid these things no mind. Its focus was singular, directed by a will far greater than its own, toward the northern reaches where something had disturbed the careful order of the Dark Lord's domain. As it crossed into the lands that had once been Angmar, the Nazgul felt the change immediately. The air grew colder, but not with the honest bite of northern winter. This was a cold that had purpose, that moved with intention. It flowed like water, seeking its level, pooling in valleys and creeping along ridges with patient inevitability. The wraith's mount shrieked a sound like metal tearing and banked away from the worst of it. The Nazgul forced the beast onward. Its master had commanded reconnaissance, and reconnaissance it would provide, though every instinct, if such remnants could still be called instinct, urged retreat. Below, the ruins of Carn Dûm came into view, but they were ruins no longer. Black ice rose in geometric precision, towers that caught no light, walls that seemed to absorb the very concept of warmth. At the center, a citadel stood where before there had been only broken stones and bitter memory. The wraith circled lower, extending its senses. It could perceive the flows of power as mortal eyes perceived light, and what it perceived now made it recoil. The Barrow Downs, distant to the south, pulsed with activity that was organized, methodical. The whites that had dwelt there in chaotic malevolence now moved in formation, their individual hatreds subsumed into a greater network. But it was not the network of rings and binding that Sauron had perfected. This was something else, something more direct and brutally efficient. A presence touched the edge of the Nazgul's consciousness. It was not a greeting. It was not a challenge. It was an examination, cold and clinical, as if the wraith itself were being measured for some purpose it could not comprehend. The touch was invasive in a way that even Sauron's dominion was not. The Dark Lord bound through promises made, and oaths twisted through the slow corruption of desire. This was different. This simply reached out and tested the integrity of the wraith's binding, the way a craftsman might test the quality of another's work. The Nazgul tried to withdraw to pull back behind the protections that its servitude to Sauron provided. But the presence followed, not pursuing, but simply observing, noting the structure of the bonds that held the wraith in thrall. It felt like being dissected, while still aware, like having one's innermost architecture laid bare to a scrutiny that held no malice, because it held no emotion at all. Then from somewhere deep in the ice citadel, a will spoke. Not in words, not in images, but in pure concept that bypassed all mediation and understanding. Interesting. The bond between the Nazgul and Sauron pulled taut. The wraith felt its master's attention snap to full focus, felt the Dark Lord's power surge along the connection that had bound it for millennia. The contest lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, the Nazgul experienced something it had not known since its mortal death. The sensation of being fought over, of being claimed by two different authorities whose concepts of ownership were fundamentally incompatible. Sauron's pull was like iron chain, ancient and unbreakable, forged through years of slow corruption and sealed with oaths that transcended death itself. The other pull, the one that emanated from the frozen throne, was like gravity, inevitable and patient, requiring no justification and offering no negotiation. It simply was, and it expected all else to conform. The wraith tore free, not through its own effort, but through Sauron's violent assertion of dominion. It fled south, its mount screaming its formless body, trailing something that might have been frost or might have been the visible manifestation of violated essence. Behind it, the ice citadel stood unmoved, and the presence within made no effort to pursue. It had learned what it wished to learn. In the ruins south of Bree, a small settlement of men huddled against the autumn chill. The rangers who passed through brought strange news that winter. The Barrow Downs had gone quiet, they said. The whites no longer troubled travelers, no longer dragged victims into the dark mounds. At first the villagers had celebrated, believing some blessing had fallen upon the cursed place. Then the first patrol failed to return. The second patrol found them 3 days later, standing in perfect formation along the western edge of the downs. They were upright, these missing men, their postures rigid and correct. Their weapons remained sheathed. Their packs sat neatly at their feet. But their eyes stared forward with a blankness that went beyond mere death. When the living rangers approached, calling their names, the dead did not respond. They simply stood awaiting orders that would never come from any voice the living could hear. One of the rangers, a woman named Hathel, who had tracked orcs through the Trollshaws and survived an encounter with wargs in the Lone Lands, stepped forward to touch the shoulder of her former companion. The body was cold, far colder than it should have been, even in death. And the flesh beneath her hand felt somehow different, not rotting, not decayed, but altered in a way that made her stomach turn. It was as if the man's body had been repurposed, transformed from a vessel of life into a component of some greater mechanism. "We need to burn them," said another ranger, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or might have been rage. "No," Athel said quietly. She withdrew her hand and stepped back, her eyes never leaving the line of motionless dead. "We need to report this, exactly as it is. Someone needs to understand what's happening here." "What is happening?" Hathor was silent for a long moment, watching the dead men stand in their perfect rows, their discipline in death exceeding anything they had managed in life. Finally she spoke, and her words carried the weight of a truth she wished she did not understand. "The dead are learning to organize." They left the standing corpses where they were and rode hard for Rivendell, bearing news that would confirm Gandalf's worst suspicions and add urgency to preparations that were already proving inadequate. In Minas Tirith, far to the south, Denethor, son of Ecthelion, sat in the tower hall and listened to reports from his captains with a face carved from granite. The war with Mordor had not yet begun in earnest, but its shadow stretched long across Gondor, and every day brought fresh evidence that the conflict would be unlike anything the realm had faced before. Orc raids along the borders of Ithilien, mysterious disappearances in the mountain passes, the restlessness of the very stone beneath the earth, as if the bones of the world were stirring in some ancient, troubled dream. But now came word from the north that made even these concerns seem manageable by comparison. A ranger of Ithilien, one of the scouts who kept watch along the borders of the dead marshes, stood before the steward and spoke of things he had seen with his own eyes. The marshes had always been a place of sorrow, where the faces of the dead stared up through murky water, forever trapped in the moment of their perishing. It was a place to be avoided, to be passed with speed and without looking down, lest the eyes of the slain draw the living to join them in their watery grave. But something had changed. "The water is freezing, my lord," the scout reported, his weathered face pale beneath its tan. "Not the whole marsh, just certain areas in patterns I cannot comprehend. And where the ice forms the faces beneath, they change, man. Their expressions shift from anguish to something else. Something that looks almost like attentiveness." "Attentiveness," Denethor repeated flatly. "Yes, my lord, as if they are waiting for instruction. And the mist that rises from the marsh at dawn, it moves differently now. It gathers in columns and formations. My fellows and I, we chose to withdraw rather than investigate further." "A wise choice," Denethor said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely pleased by the caution. "Return to your post. Continue observation, but engage nothing. I want regular reports." After the scout departed, Denethor rose from his seat and moved to the western window, looking out over the white city toward the distant mountains, where Mordor crouched like a cancer upon the land. He had studied the histories. He knew the patterns of Sauron's wars, the methods by which the Dark Lord extended his influence. Corruption through lies, temptation through promises of power, the slow turning of hearts until whole kingdoms rotted from within. This was not that. This spoke of a different methodology entirely, one that bypassed the complexities of motivation and desire, and went straight to the fundamental question of who held authority over death itself. Denethor had spent years peering into the Palantir, matching wills with Sauron across the void, testing the limits of his own pride against the Dark Lord's patient malice. He knew that war. He understood that enemy. But this was something new, and in his heart, though he would never admit it aloud, Denethor felt something he had not experienced in decades. Not fear, for he had long ago burned that weakness from his soul, but uncertainty, which was perhaps worse. Two shadows now fell across Middle-earth, and the steward of Gondor could not yet determine if they would destroy each other or combine into something that no force of the Free Peoples could withstand. In his library in Rivendell, Gandalf stood before a map of Middle-earth, his finger tracing the reports from rangers across the north. Red marks indicated confirmed sightings of the new phenomenon, the organized undead. The frozen areas, the strange silence that had fallen over places that had once been merely dangerous, but were now something else entirely. Blue marks showed the positions of Sauron's forces, the movements of orcs, and the flight paths of the Nazgul. The two colors did not overlap. Not yet. "They are circling each other," Elrond said, standing beside him. "Testing boundaries. Neither has committed to full engagement." "Because neither yet understands what the other is," Gandalf replied. He set down his pipe, the smoke curling upward in patterns that seemed to carry their own meaning. "Sauron is patient. He will watch, calculate, wait for the optimal moment to strike. But this other," he gestured toward the red marks, "this other does not seem to wait. It acts. It transforms. It claims." "Then why has it not moved more openly against Mordor?" "Because it is building something," Gandalf said slowly, the realization forming even as he spoke the words. "It is not here to conquer in the traditional sense. It is here to establish infrastructure. Every undead it claims, every frozen patch of ground, every white repurposed, these are not victories. These are installations. It is building a network." Elrond's expression darkened. "For what purpose?" "That," Gandalf said grimly, "is what terrifies me. I do not know. But I know this: when two powers of such magnitude both seek to claim dominion over the same resource, in this case the dead, the conflict is inevitable. And when that conflict comes, the living will be caught between forces that view them not as enemies to be fought, but as materials to be processed." He turned from the map to face his old friend directly. "We must send word to all the free peoples. Gondor, Rohan, the Shire, what remains of the Dale lands. They must understand that the war we feared is no longer the only war we face. And we must pray that these two shadows destroy each other before either grows strong enough to devour us all." Elrond nodded slowly. "I will dispatch messengers at first light. But Gandalf, if they do not destroy each other, if one emerges victorious," the wizard's face was grave, "then we face an enemy that has already proven it can defeat a power older and darker than anything, save Morgoth himself. And I do not know if there is any force in Middle-earth capable of standing against that." Outside the window, the evening star rose in the western sky, cold and distant. In the north, beyond sight but not beyond, sensing the ice continued its patient expansion. And in the east, in the dark tower that pierced the sky like a blackened fang, Sauron's will contemplated the board upon which a new game had begun. The pieces were not yet in motion. But both players now understood that the game had changed and that the stakes were nothing less than the definition of death itself. The Nazgul did not sleep, for sleep was a mortal need it had shed along with flesh and name and the capacity for dreams. But it rested in a fashion settling into the hollow places of Minas Morgul, where the walls themselves whispered with ancient malice and the very stones remembered fear. Here in the tower that had once been Minas Ithil before, the darkness claimed it. The wraith recovered from its flight north, allowing the violation it had experienced to fade into the background static of its eternal torment. It had reported what it witnessed. The images, the sensations, the fundamental wrongness of what now occupied Angmar, all of this had been transmitted through the bond to its master in Barad-dûr. Sauron's response had been measured, calculated, bearing all the hallmarks of a mind that had orchestrated the fall of kingdoms and needed no haste to achieve its ends. The investigation would continue. The Dark Lord had decreed, but with caution. This new element required study, not immediate confrontation. The Nazgul accepted this directive as it accepted all directives without question, without will of its own. Yet somewhere in the hollow cavity where its heart had once beat, a tremor remained. Not fear, for it had been emptied of such emotions long ago, but an echo of disturbance like a bell that had been struck and still vibrated with the memory of impact. That echo had a name, though the wraith did not possess the capacity to speak it. Violation. The presence in the north had not simply observed the Nazgul. It had examined it, tested its structure, probed the architecture of its binding with the same detachment a craftsman might show when evaluating another's work. And in that examination, the wraith had felt impossibly terrifyingly, as though it might be claimed by something other than the power that had held it for millennia. The sensation lingered like frost that would not melt. 3 nights after the first contact, the Lich King moved again. He did not leave his throne. Physical presence was inefficient when consciousness could travel along pathways that death had carved into the world's foundation. He simply extended his awareness southward, following the network of undead he had already claimed the whites of the Barrow Downs, the risen corpses that now stood in disciplined formation across the desolate moors. And through them, he perceived, another wraith had come north. Not the same one that had fled before, but a similar construct bound by similar means to the same distant will. This one flew lower, more cautiously keeping to the valleys where the ice had not yet fully claimed the land. It was gathering information, observing the extent of the changes, noting the patterns of undead movement with the diligence of a scout performing reconnaissance. The Lich King watched it circle for precisely 47 minutes before he acted. Frostmourne left its sheath without a sound. The blade moved through air that had already begun to crystallize in sympathy with its presence, leaving a wake of frozen vapor that did not disperse. The Lich King did not point the sword at the distant wraith. He simply held it, allowing the weapon's nature to resonate with his will. And through that resonance reached out across the miles that separated throne from target. The Nazgul felt the touch like a hook, sliding beneath scales, like fingers closing around something essential that had never before been grasped from outside. It tried to bank away to flee, as the previous scout had fled, but the hook had already found purchase. Not in flesh, for it had no flesh. Not in bone, for its bones were dust, centuries scattered. The hook had found the wraith's essence itself, that core of identity that bound the scattered fragments of its being into a coherent whole. And Frostmourne began to pull. The sensation was unlike anything the Nazgul had experienced in its long existence. When Sauron had first bound it through the ring, the process had been gradual, seductive, a slow erosion of will that felt almost like choice, until the moment came when choice no longer existed. This was not that. This was immediate invasive, a forced extraction that bypassed every defense the wraith had been given. The hook pulled, and the Nazgul felt itself beginning to slide toward it, felt the fundamental structure of its being start to separate from the anchor that had held it for 3,000 years. In Barad-dûr, Sauron's attention snapped to full focus. The contest that followed lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, the Nazgul existed in a state of impossible contradiction. Two powers, both absolute in their claim, both unyielding in their assertion of ownership, pulled at the wraith from opposite directions. Sauron's pull was like a chain forged in the fires of Mount Doom itself, ancient and unbreakable, reinforced by oaths that transcended death and promises that had been woven into the fabric of the wraith's very existence. The other pull, the one that came from the north, carried on the edge of that hungering blade, was like gravity made manifest, requiring no justification and offering no quarter. The Nazgul screamed, though it had no throat with which to scream, and no air to carry the sound. What emerged was a tear in the fabric of reality itself, a wound through which poured something that might have been anguish, or might simply have been the noise of systems fundamentally incompatible, trying to occupy the same space. Sauron pulled harder. 3,000 years of binding, 3,000 years of corruption so complete that it had hollowed out everything the Wraith had once been. All of this weight came to bear on the contest. The Dark Lord's will was patient vast, backed by knowledge that predated the sun and the moon. He had bound the Nine through means that went beyond mere magic, that touched upon the fundamental nature of promises and debt, and the slow poison of desire fulfilled and then turned rancid. To break that binding was to rewrite laws that had been established before the world took its current form. But the Lich King was not trying to break the binding. He was testing its limits. Frostmourne pulled one final time, not with force but with precision, and something tore. Not the whole wraith that would have required more time, more preparation, the proper conditions, but a fragment, a sliver of essence that contained within it a complete map of how the binding functioned, detached and flowed along the blade's edge back to its wielder. The Nazgul fled. Its mount shrieked and dove, putting distance between itself and the north with desperate speed. The Wraith did not slow until it had crossed the misty mountains and left the frozen lands far behind. But something had changed. Where before it had been whole as any creature of its nature could be, now there was a gap, a hollow place where a piece of its essence had been excised with surgical precision. And in that gap, frost had begun to form. In the ice citadel of Carn Dûm, the Lich King examined what he had claimed. The fragment of Nazgul essence hovered before him, suspended in the air by will alone, slowly rotating so that he could observe it from all angles. It was incomplete, barely a fraction of the whole, but it was enough. Within this sliver, he could see the structure of Sauron's binding, the way the ring's power had been woven through the Wraith's identity, the oaths that held it in place, the slow corruption that had transformed a mortal king into a hollow servant. It was impressive work, he admitted dispassionately. Patient, thorough, built to last across ages. But it was also fragile in ways its creator perhaps did not recognize. It relied on the Wraith's continued existence as a coherent entity. It assumed that identity, however corrupted, remained the foundation upon which control was built. The Lich King understood control differently. He closed his gauntleted hand, and the fragment compressed its structure, collapsing as he reduced it to its essential components. Information flowed into him, not knowledge in the traditional sense, but data. The location of Barad-dûr, the nature of Sauron's attention, the feel of a will that had spent millennia weaving its influence through promises and rings, and the slow transformation of ambition into slavery. Methodical, the Lich King said to the empty hall. His voice carried no judgment, only observation, but limited. He released the compressed fragment, allowing it to dissipate into vapor that would eventually rejoin the network of cold spreading across the northern lands. What he had learned was sufficient. The entity in the east was powerful, ancient, patient, beyond mortal comprehension. But it was also bound to its methods, constrained by the very thoroughness that made those methods effective. It could not act quickly. It could not adapt to variables that fell outside its carefully constructed plans. The Lich King could. Dawn came gray and cold to a village south of Bree, one of the small settlements that dotted the wilderness between the Shire and the ruins of Arnor's old glory. The inhabitants woke to find rangers standing in their square. Not living rangers, the villagers knew the Dunedain by sight, had traded with them for years, had sheltered them when storms came through the hills. These were rangers they recognized, but they were wrong. The dead men stood in perfect formation. 7 of them, arranged in a line that would have done credit to the best drilled soldiers of Gondor. Their weapons remained sheathed. Their hands hung loose at their sides. Their faces bore no expression, no sign of the torment that tales said accompanied the return of the unquiet dead. They simply stood, and in their standing communicated something more terrible than any supernatural horror could have achieved. They had been repurposed. For 3 hours, the villagers huddled in their homes, peering through shuttered windows at the silent dead. No one dared approach. No one suggested burning them or attempting to put their spirits to rest. The wrongness of their presence went beyond the traditional boundaries of ghost or revenant. These were not spirits seeking vengeance or unfinished business. They were not even truly present, not in the sense that mattered. They were conduits, channels through which something distant observed and waited. Then, at the 3rd hour after dawn, all 7 corpses moved in perfect synchronization. They knelt. Their knees struck the frozen earth with identical precision, the sound like 7 hammers falling on an anvil. And they spoke. Not with their own voices, those throats had long since lost the capacity for speech, but with a single voice that emerged from all 7 mouths, simultaneously, each corpse speaking the same words, at the same instant, with the same inflection. "Tell the one who claims the dead of this world," the voice said flat and cold as a tombstone in winter, "that another has arrived. Tell him that his methods are noted. Tell him that his work will be evaluated. And tell him this, what he has bound I can unbind. What he has claimed I can reclaim. The dead do not belong to him. They belong to function." The last word fell like a closing door. The 7 corpses remained kneeling for exactly 1 minute, more long enough for the message to be absorbed, long enough for witnesses to understand that this was not madness or hallucination, but terrible, deliberate communication. Then, as one, they collapsed. Not falling, but folding inward, their forms losing cohesion as though the force animating them had simply withdrawn, leaving nothing but empty vessels that had briefly served a purpose and were now discarded. When the rangers from Rivendell arrived that afternoon, summoned by frantic riders, they found the 7 bodies arranged in a perfect line. Cold had claimed them so completely that frost covered every inch of exposed skin in crystalline patterns that resembled nothing so much as circuitry, as though the corpses had briefly been part of some vast machine before being disconnected and left behind. One of the rangers, a woman named Dirhal, who had seen war and loss and the slow decay of her people across generation and stood before the bodies for a long time without speaking. Finally, she turned to her companions. "Burn them," she said. "Burn them, scatter the ashes, and mark this ground. No one is to be buried within a day's ride of this place. If the dead are being used as messengers, we cannot risk providing more material." "What do we tell Lord Elrond?" asked a younger ranger. Dirhael looked north toward lands that had been empty of hope for 1,000 years and now hosted something that made even those empty lands seem preferable by comparison. "Tell him that the war he feared has become more complicated," she said quietly. "Tell him that something is treating death not as an ending, but as a resource. And tell him that whatever is in the north just declared its intentions to Mordor in a language we should not be able to understand, but somehow do." She paused, her weathered face troubled by thoughts she did not voice. "Tell him that the dead have learned to deliver messages," she said at last. "And pray that they do not learn what else they might deliver." The rangers departed, carrying news that would reach Rivendell by nightfall, and spread from there to every outpost and settlement that still clung to hope in the diminishing light of the Third Age. Behind them, smoke rose from the pyre where 7 bodies burned, and the wind carried ash toward both north and east, scattering it across lands that were learning to recognize a new kind of shadow. One that did not creep or corrupt, but simply arrived, assessed, and began the work of optimization. In the ice citadel, the Lich King sat motionless on his throne, his consciousness extending through the network of undead that grew with each passing hour. He had delivered his message. Now he would wait to see how the entity in the east responded. Patience, he understood, was a tool like any other, and he had learned to wield every tool with perfect efficiency. In Barad-dûr, where no natural light had penetrated for 3,000 years, Sauron contemplated the message that had been delivered through the mouths of the dead. The words themselves were unremarkable, direct, blunt, the kind of declaration that beings of lesser sophistication might make when they wished to project strength. But the method of delivery revealed something far more interesting than the crude threat contained in the message itself. This entity from the north understood systems. It grasped the fundamental principle that bodies were merely vessels, that consciousness could be transmitted through appropriate channels, that death was not an ending, but a transformation of state. These were concepts that Sauron had spent millennia refining, and to see them employed with such casual efficiency by a power that had arrived mere days ago suggested an intellect that had encountered these principles before in some other context, in some other world. The fragment of Nazgul essence that had been extracted also told a story. Sauron had retrieved it, or rather, he had pulled back the portions that the northern entity had not claimed, and in examining what remained, he could perceive the method by which it had been taken. Not through corruption or slow erosion, as he would have done, but through direct severance. The binding had been treated not as a relationship to be subverted, but as a structure to be analyzed and then cut with surgical precision. Interesting. The Dark Lord's consciousness expanded through the network of spies and servants that spread across Middle-earth like a web. Orcs in the mountains, spies in the courts of men, creatures that crawled in darkness and reported what they witnessed. All of these channels fed information back to the center, and through them, Sauron could perceive the shape of what was occurring in the north without needing to look directly at it. The pattern was clear. The entity was building infrastructure, establishing nodes of control, transforming the dead from chaotic remnants into organized components. It was doing in days what Sauron had taken years to accomplish in Mordor. This suggested either vast power carelessly deployed, or more troubling vast power, efficiently directed, according to principles that had been perfected elsewhere. The question then was not whether to engage this new element. The question was how to engage it in a manner that served Sauron's greater purpose. A direct confrontation would be premature. He had not spent 3,000 years building his power only to expend it against an unknown variable without first understanding its limitations. The entity had demonstrated strength and efficiency, but it had not yet demonstrated patience or subtlety. It acted quickly, directly, obviously. These were characteristics that could be exploited. Sauron would do what he had always done when faced with a power he did not yet understand. He would extend an offer, and in extending the offer, he would observe. And in observing, he would find the weakness that every power possessed, no matter how formidable it appeared. The Dark Lord's will gathered itself, compressing into a spike of pure intention that pierced the distance between Barad-dûr and Carn-dûm like a spear thrown across the leagues. It was not an attack. It was a signal. A knock upon a door that until now had remained closed. In the ice citadel, the Lich King registered the touch of another consciousness against his own. The contact came not through any physical medium, but through the channels Werewolf itself could travel the same pathways he used to direct his network of undead, the same frequencies upon which Dominion resonated. The presence that made contact was vast, not in the simple sense of size, but in the sense of depth of layers, upon layers of calculation and patience, compressed into a single point of attention. It carried with it the weight of ages, the accumulated experience of 3 millennia, spent weaving influence through promises and rings, and the slow transformation of desire into dependence. The Lich King allowed the contact. He did not welcome it. Welcome implied hospitality, a concept that no longer applied to him. But he permitted it, opening a channel through which communication could occur, and waited to see what this ancient entity wished to communicate. What arrived was not words, but concepts delivered with a precision that spoke of long practice in this form of exchange. An image of Middle-earth as a whole, vast and complex, filled with competing powers and conflicting wills. A sense of order imposed from above, of structure, maintaining itself through careful management of dependencies. An offering oblique, but clear recognition accommodation. A division of territory and purpose that would allow both powers to coexist without the wasteful expenditure of direct conflict. And beneath it all, woven so subtly that a lesser mind might not have noticed, an assumption. An expectation that this conversation would proceed according to certain rules, that engagement would follow patterns established over ages of such exchanges, that negotiation was possible, because all beings ultimately sought to maximize their advantage and minimize their risk. The Lich King processed this in the span of a heartbeat. He recognized what was being offered and what was being presumed. He understood that the entity in the East was testing him, measuring his responses, seeking to establish the parameters within which their interaction would occur. It was well done, expertly crafted, the product of vast experience in such matters. It was also irrelevant. The Lich King's response was not delivered in concepts or images. It was delivered in raw assertion, compressed into a statement so absolute it left no room for interpretation. I do not negotiate territories, I establish them. A pause during which the other present seemed to recalibrate, then a shift in approach. More direct now, less assumption of mutual understanding. A question, essentially, what did he want? I want function, the Lich King replied. This world operates in chaos. Death occurs without purpose. The deceased remain chaotic. This is inefficient. Another pause, longer this time. Then a new offering. Not cooperation, but redirection. Information about a location where the dead were numerous, where old battles had soaked the earth with blood and left their mark in ways that persisted across ages. A place that could serve his purpose of establishing function, if that was truly what he sought. The Dead Marshes. South and east, near the borders of Mordor itself. Thousands upon thousands of corpses preserved in murky water, their faces visible beneath the surface, trapped in the moment of their deaths. Unused. Unclaimed. Waiting. The Lich King considered this. The other entity was offering him a resource, but doing so in a location that would draw him closer to Mordor, closer to observation, closer to a position where the ancient power could assess him more thoroughly. It was bait, obviously so, but bait that served both their purposes. He would gain access to the resources he required. The other would gain data about his methods and limitations. Acceptable. I will attend to this location, the Lich King said. And then, because the entity in the east would be expecting some acknowledgement of its gesture, he added, your information is noted. The contact withdrew, not severed, but allowed to thin, maintaining the barest thread of connection that would permit future communication if either side chose to re-establish it. The Lich King remained on his throne processing what had been learned from this exchange. The entity in the east was sophisticated. It understood leverage and misdirection. It thought in spans of centuries and planned in layers upon layers of contingency. It had offered him a genuine resource, while simultaneously positioning him where it wished him to be. The dead marshes would serve his purposes, but they would also reveal his methods to an opponent who clearly valued information as highly as direct power. This suggested a strategy. The entity expected him to establish his network in the marshes, to transform the dead there into components of his infrastructure. It would observe this process, learn from it, and develop countermeasures based on what it witnessed. This was sound thinking, patient and thorough, exactly what one would expect from a mind that had toppled kingdoms through careful planning. The entity's weakness, then, was its assumption that others operated by the same principles. It expected gradual expansion, methodical construction, the careful building of advantages before committing to direct conflict. It had spent 3,000 years perfecting this approach, and it assumed that any being capable of the work the Lich King had demonstrated would operate from similar foundations. It did not understand that the Lich King had no foundations. He had only will, and will required no time to gather itself. He could act immediately, completely, without the need for careful preparation or the accumulation of advantages. He could simply arrive, assess, and transform. The entity in the east had offered him the dead marshes to observe him. He would accept the offer, and he would use the observation against the observer. In the wilderness between Rivendell and the Misty Mountains, Gandalf stood on a ridge overlooking the lands to the north and east. The wizard had been traveling for days, moving between outposts and settlements, gathering reports and witnessing firsthand the changes that had swept across the northern territories. What he had learned troubled him more with each new piece of information that reached his ears. The undead were organizing, not in the chaotic, malevolent fashion that tales of the restless dead typically described, but with discipline and purpose. They stood in formations. They moved in coordinated groups. They responded to directives that came from no visible source, acting with the unity of a hive, while retaining enough individual function to adapt to local conditions. And they were spreading. Not quickly, the expansion was methodical, even careful, but steadily. Each day, the frozen zones extended a bit farther south. Each night, more burial grounds fell silent, in ways that suggested something worse than haunting. The dead were being claimed, and the claiming followed a pattern that Gandalf could not fully decipher, but recognized as systematic. "It's building something," he said aloud, though no one stood near enough to hear. Not conquering, building. The distinction mattered. A conqueror could be fought with armies resisted through fortifications worn down through attrition. A builder, on the other hand, a builder changed the very ground upon which the conflict would be fought. A builder established new rules, created new realities, transformed the battlefield itself into an expression of their will. And now, Sauron, patient and calculating, had made contact with this new element. Gandalf did not know how he knew this. Some disturbance in the air, some shift in the currents of power that flowed through Middle-earth. But he was certain of it. The two shadows had acknowledged each other. They had communicated. And whatever words or concepts had been exchanged, the result would not be to anyone's benefit, save their own. "They will test each other," Gandalf murmured, his fingers tightening on his staff. "And in that testing, the free peoples will be the material upon which their experiments are conducted." He turned from the ridge and began the long walk back toward Rivendell, where Elrond would need to hear what he had witnessed and what he feared. The war they had prepared for was no longer the war they faced. The enemy they understood was no longer the only enemy that threatened them. Two powers now vied for dominion over death, and regardless of which proved stronger, the living would pay the price of their contest. In the dead marshes where ancient battles had poisoned the earth and left their dead suspended in dark water, something began to change. The corpses that stared upward through the murky depths, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish and rage and final despair, remained as they had been for centuries. But around them, the water itself began to cool. Not freezing, not yet, but dropping in temperature degree by slow degree, as though winter were seeping in from some distant source. The marshes had always been a place of sorrow, a location that even the hardiest travelers avoided when possible. Now, as the temperature dropped and patterns began to form in the mist that rose from the water each dawn, they became something else entirely. They became an invitation, an opportunity, a stage upon which two philosophies of control would demonstrate their methods and measure each other's strength. And in the distance, unseen but present, both powers observed the marshes with attention that was absolute. One waited to see what would be built. The other prepared to build it. The dead, as always, had no say in the matter. But then, that had never been the point. The dead marshes had existed in their current state for nearly 3,000 years, born from the cataclysm that had ended the last alliance's siege of Mordor. The battlefield of Dagorlad, where men and elves had fought against the forces of darkness in numbers that defied comprehension, had subsided into boggy wasteland as the land itself seemed to reject the weight of so much death. The fallen had sunk into the earth, preserved by waters that would not let them rest their faces visible beneath the surface, like accusations frozen in time. It was a place of mourning, of warning of sorrow made geography. Even the hardiest travelers avoided it when possible, and those who could not avoid it moved through quickly, eyes forward, refusing to look down at the faces that stared upward through the murk. The dead of Dagorlad served no purpose save as reminder of the price of war, of the finality of death, of the thin margin by which darkness had been held at bay. The Lich King did not arrive at the marshes in person. He had no need to transport his physical form across the leagues that separated Angmar from the borders of Mordor. Distance was meaningful only to those bound by flesh and the limitations of sequential travel. He simply extended his consciousness along the network he had already established, through the whites of the Barrow Downs, through the undead that now stood in disciplined ranks across the northern territories, through the pathways that death had carved into the foundations of the world. And when his attention touched the dead marshes, the water began to change. It did not freeze, not immediately. The transformation was more subtle than that, more methodical. The temperature dropped first degree by careful degree, as though winter were seeping upward from some source deeper than the boggy earth could explain. The faces beneath the water, those thousands upon thousands of corpses that had stared upward for 3 millennia, began to shift. Not physically, for they remained trapped in the muck that had claimed them, but in expression. The anguish that had marked them began to smooth, to flatten, to take on the aspect of something that might have been attentiveness, if such a quality could be attributed to the long dead. The Lich King established his first node at the northern edge of the marshes, where the land rose slightly and the water grew shallow enough to reveal the silhouettes of the fallen. He did not raise these dead, not yet. Instead, he claimed them extending through the murk, to touch each essence in turn, cataloging what remained of their identity and binding it to the network with the same precision he had demonstrated in the Barrow Downs. Each corpse became a point of perception. Each trapped face became a window through which awareness could flow. The dead of Dagorlad, who had served no function for 3,000 years, beyond reminding the living of mortality's weight, were given purpose. They were made components of a system that stretched from the frozen citadel of Carn Dûm to this fetid bog on the very borders of Mordor itself. The transformation accelerated. Ice began to form, not everywhere, but in patterns, geometric configurations that looked almost like circuitry when viewed from above, connecting node to node, establishing pathways through which Will could travel with minimal resistance. Where the ice touched the water, the faces beneath changed more dramatically. Their eyes, which had been glazed with death for ages, took on the pale blue glow that marked those claimed by the helm of domination. The marshes were becoming a factory. Not for producing undead in the traditional sense, the corpses were too deeply mired to be easily raised and deployed, but for processing essence itself. Each claimed soul served as a relay point, amplifying the signal that originated in Angmar and allowing it to extend farther south than should have been possible given the distance involved. The dead marshes were being transformed from a monument to death into a tool for expanding the reach of control itself. In Minas Tirith, the scouts returned with reports that Denethor received in silence, his face carved from stone, as he listened to descriptions of ice forming in patterns across the marshes of the dead beneath the water, taking on characteristics that suggested awareness rather than mere preservation. The steward dismissed the scouts with a gesture and sat alone in the tower hall for a long time, considering what this development meant. Sauron had led this northern entity to the marshes. That much was clear. The Dark Lord had offered a resource, and the offer had been accepted. But what Sauron had expected to learn from observation might not align with what was actually occurring. The entity was not simply raising the dead or corrupting them in the traditional sense. It was creating infrastructure, establishing a presence that could support operations far more extensive than anything attempted before. Denethor rose from his seat and moved to the window that overlooked the eastern approaches to the city. Somewhere beyond his sight, beyond the ranges and the plains, Mordor crouched like a spider in its web, and now something else, something that treated death as a resource to be organized rather than a state to be feared, was establishing itself at Mordor's very doorstep. "Two spiders," Denethor murmured. "And we are the flies caught between their territories." He returned to his seat and began composing orders. The defenses of Gondor would need to be adjusted. Patrols around the marshes would be doubled with strict instructions to observe, but not engage. Information was needed more than valor at this stage. They needed to understand what was being built in the marshes before they could hope to counter it. But even as he wrote, Denethor felt the weight of a truth he could not ignore. Understanding would not be enough. Two powers of this magnitude, both focused on death itself as the foundation of their dominion, would not be satisfied with the marshes alone. They would expand. They would test each other's boundaries, and the living caught between them would be processed into material for whichever power proved more efficient at claiming what it desired. East of the marshes, in the tower of Barad-dûr, Sauron observed the transformation with attention that was absolute. His consciousness extended through the network of spies and servants that webbed across Middle-earth, and through them he perceived what was occurring in territory he had long considered peripheral to his main concerns. The entity was not behaving as expected. Sauron had offered the marshes anticipating gradual claiming, careful establishment of control, the methodical building of advantages that characterized any sophisticated operation. What he witnessed instead was systematic transformation occurring with speed that suggested either vast resources deployed carelessly or, more troubling, vast resources deployed with perfect efficiency because the entity had performed such operations countless times before. The ice patterns were particularly interesting. They were not random. They formed a network, yes, but not merely a network of communication. They formed a processing system, each node amplifying and refining the signal that passed through it. The dead were not being raised as soldiers or servants. They were being converted into components of a distributed consciousness, pieces of a greater whole that could extend its awareness across distances that should have been impossible given the limitations of even the most sophisticated necromancy. Sauron recalculated. He had assumed the entity operated from principles similar to his own, binding through promises, controlling through corruption, building power through the slow accumulation of dependencies. But this was different. This was engineering. This was treating consciousness itself as a substrate that could be organized, refined, optimized according to specifications that had been perfected elsewhere and were now being applied to Middle-earth with the confidence of proven methodology. The Dark Lord's will gathered itself considering options. He could intervene directly, attempt to disrupt the network being established in the marshes. But that would reveal his own methods and limitations to an opponent that had already demonstrated the capacity to analyze and counter the techniques he employed. Better to observe, to learn to understand the full extent of what was being built before committing to action. But observation alone was insufficient. If the entity was establishing infrastructure in the marshes, Sauron needed to understand not just the structure, but the purpose it served. And the best way to understand purpose was to see what happened when the structure was completed. He would allow the work to continue. He would watch it reach fruition. And in that completion, he would see what the entity truly intended, what goal it pursued, what weakness existed in a system that prioritized efficiency over the kind of depth that 3,000 years of patient corruption could achieve. The game continued. The pieces were moving, and the board itself was changing square by square, as death itself was redefined from ending, to resource from fear to function. By the third night after the Lich King's attention had first touched the marshes, the transformation was visible even to mortal eyes. The ice formation stretched across the northern reaches of the bog in networks that caught the moonlight and reflected it in patterns that suggested meaning to any who observed them closely enough. The dead beneath the water no longer simply stared upward. They watched their glowing eyes tracking movement along the paths that skirted the marsh's edges. And in the deeper pools where the water was darkest and the dead were most numerous, something began to rise. Not corpses pulling themselves from the muck, they remained trapped, serving their function as nodes in the network, but vapor, thick and gray, that gathered in columns rather than dispersing randomly. The mist moved with purpose, flowing along channels defined by the ice patterns, accumulating at certain points, before dispersing again according to rhythms that suggested respiration, or perhaps the cycling of some vast machine. A patrol from Ithilien, watching from the western edge of the marshes, witnessed the mist form into what might have been shapes vaguely humanoid, translucent, moving in formation as they drifted across the water. The rangers did not approach. They marked the location, noted the time, and withdrew to report what they had seen. One of them, a man named Mablung, who had served in the Rangers for 2 decades and seen much that troubled him, paused before they departed to look back at the marshes. The mist shapes were still visible, moving in their precise formations, and beneath the water thousands of faces glowed with cold light. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, and then immediately regretted the observation. Beautiful was the wrong word. But there was an aesthetics to what had been created here. A terrible symmetry that spoke to some part of the mind, that appreciated pattern and order, even when applied to things that should remain chaotic and broken. His companion, younger and less weathered by years of watching, looked at him with confusion. Beautiful, efficient. Mablung corrected, though that word, too, felt inadequate. It's made death efficient, and that is worse than making it terrible. They departed, carrying news that would reach Minas Tirith by dawn, and spread from there to every outpost that still watched the borders. The marshes had been transformed. Death had been organized, and whatever purpose this served, it was not yet complete. In the ice citadel of Carn Dûm, the Lich King remained on his throne, his consciousness extending through the network that now stretched from Angmar to the borders of Mordor itself. The dead marshes were functioning exactly as designed. Each node processed essence and relayed signal with precision that met his specifications. The system was stable, self-sustaining, requiring minimal attention to maintain and capable of supporting operations far more extensive than what he had implemented thus far. But the marshes were not the goal. They were the demonstration. They were the proof of concept that would show the entity in Barad-dûr what true efficiency meant. What could be accomplished when death was treated not as an ending to be feared or a corruption to be slowly cultivated, but as a state to be managed according to optimal specifications. Sauron would observe. Sauron would analyze. Sauron would attempt to understand the system with the same patient thoroughness he had applied to building his own empire. And in that observation and analysis, he would reveal his own assumptions, his own methods, his own limitations. The Lich King would learn these limitations, and when he had learned them, he would exploit them. The network pulsed with activity, each node reporting its status, each claimed essence performing its function within the greater whole. The dead marshes had been a place of sorrow. Now, they were a tool. And tools the Lich King understood existed to be used for the purpose their creator intended. Middle-earth was learning what it meant when death became organized. Soon it would learn what organized death could accomplish when wielded by a will that knew no hesitation, no doubt, no mercy. The furnace had been built. Now it was time to demonstrate what it could forge. The tower of Minas Morgul stood against the eastern sky like a wound that would not heal. Once it had been Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, bright and fair, built by the men of Gondor to watch the passes into Mordor and stand as a beacon of hope against the darkness. That had been before the siege, before the long years of assault by forces that did not tire and did not relent, before the Nazgûl had claimed it and transformed it into something that hurt to look upon directly. Now the tower glowed with a sickly phosphorescence, pale green like corpse light. And the very stones seemed to pulse with malevolence, as though the structure itself had become alive and diseased. The bridge that crossed the valley echoed with the footfalls of things that should not walk. And from the highest chamber, the Witch King of Angmar kept his vigil over the lands that Sauron had granted him to oversee. He had been the greatest of the Nine, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the one who had broken the northern kingdom and scattered its remnants across the wilderness. For 1,000 years after the fall of Angmar, he had served his master in other capacities in other lands, until at last he had been given Minas Ithil to claim and Morgul Vale to rule. He had made it a place of such terror that even orcs approached it with caution, and the very air carried whispers of dread that could break the courage of seasoned warriors. But now, standing in his tower, the Witch King felt something he had not experienced in ages beyond counting. Not fear had been burned out of him long ago, along with hope and joy and all the other weaknesses that flesh was heir to. What he felt was closer to indignation to the offense a craftsman might take when finding his workshop had been entered and his tools rearranged by another's hand. Something was touching his work. Something was claiming territory he had once held dominion over. And it was doing so with a disregard for his authority that suggested either ignorance of who he was or worse knowledge coupled with complete dismissal of his significance. The Witch King did not need reports from lesser servants to know what occurred in the north. He could feel it through the bonds that connected all the Nazgûl to their master, and through their master to the territories they oversaw. Angmar, his former seat of power, had been claimed by something that treated the ruins not with the reverence of a conqueror, acknowledging past greatness, but with the indifference of an engineer, repurposing scrap material. the dead that he had sent to those lands, the whites he had dispatched to haunt the barrows and prevent any resurgence of the northern kingdoms. These were being reorganized, stripped of the individual malevolence he had instilled in them, and converted into components of something that resembled a military installation more than a haunted wasteland. It was efficient. It was thorough. It was unbearable. The Witch King descended from his chamber, his form barely visible within the tattered robes that served as his only consistent physical manifestation. The black crown upon his head, not the great helm he wore in battle, but the lesser crown of his station, seemed to drink the sickly light of the tower as he moved through corridors that twisted in ways that violated natural geometry. His steed waited below a fell beast that had been bred in the pits of Mordor, for the specific purpose of carrying the Nazgul through the air. It was larger than an eagle, with leathery wings that could bear tremendous weight and a beak designed to tear through armor. The creature shrieked when it sensed its master approaching, not in greeting but in the simple acknowledgement of dominance that characterized all interactions in Mordor. The Witch King mounted without ceremony. He did not need to direct the beast, it knew where they were going. North, toward the frozen citadel that had sprouted from the ruins of Carn Dûm like a fungus from diseased wood. Toward the presence that had violated his former domain and needed to be reminded of certain fundamental truths about power and territory and the consequences of trespass. The flight north took hours, even for a creature bred for speed and endurance. The Witch King passed over lands he had known, when they were thriving, the remnants of Arnor the valleys, where he had led armies, the hills where kingdoms had broken before his advance. All of it had fallen to ruin after his departure as he had intended. A broken land served as better monument than any statue. But now, as he drew nearer to Angmar, he perceived changes that went beyond natural decay. The temperature dropped more rapidly than geography alone could explain. The wind, which should have been chaotic in these mountains, moved in patterns that suggested direction rather than chance. And the very air felt different, not corrupt as he might have expected from another servant of darkness, but organized as though chaos itself had been filed away and replaced with something that operated according to stricter principles. The ice citadel came into view as he crested the final range. The Witch King circled it once his steed's wings beating against air that had grown so cold it hurt even a creature that felt no pain in the traditional sense. The structure below was impressive in its own way. Not beautiful, not grand, but possessed of a clarity of purpose that communicated its function without need for embellishment. It was a hub, a nexus, a central processing point from which control radiated outward like spokes from a wheel. The Witch King had built many fortresses in his long service to Sauron, and he recognized efficiency when he saw it. This was not the work of some minor necromancer playing with powers beyond their understanding. This was expertise cold and complete, applied without hesitation to the task of transforming a dead land into operational infrastructure. He descended his mount landing on the frozen bridge that led to the citadel's main entrance. The gates, if they could be called gates, being more like apertures in the ice itself, stood open as though visitors were expected. Or as though the entity within had so little concern for physical security that it saw no need to bar entry. The Witch King dismounted and walked forward. Each step echoed despite the ice that should have muffled sound. The interior was colder than the exterior, if such a thing was possible, and the architecture followed the same principles of absolute functionality that characterized the outside. No decorations, no symbols of power, just ice and iron and angles that existed because they served the structure's purpose. At the center, raised on a platform that suggested throne more by position than by design, sat the source of the violation. The armored figure did not rise as the Witch King approached. It sat perfectly still, its posture so vertical it might have been carved from the same ice that formed the throne. Within the darkness of its helm, 2 points of pale light observed the Witch King's approach with the same interest one might show when examining an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. The Witch King stopped at the base of the platform. He did not bow. He had not bowed to any save Sauron in 3,000 years, and he would not begin now regardless of what power this entity commanded. Instead, he projected his presence outward, allowing the full weight of his nature to fill the chamber, the accumulated terror of 1,000 years of rule. The authority granted by one of the oldest powers in Middle-earth, the implicit threat that came from being the greatest of the 9. The air grew heavy with dread. The very stones seemed to recoil. In any normal circumstance, mortal or otherwise, the target of such projection would have felt their courage falter, their will weaken, their thoughts turn toward the futility of resistance. The armored figure on the throne registered no change whatsoever. "You occupy my domain," the Witch King said, his voice carrying the echo of distant screams and the weight of authority that brooked no contradiction. "You repurpose my servants. You establish yourself in territory I claimed and held for centuries. Explain yourself or face the consequences of this presumption." The silence that followed was absolute. Then finally the figure spoke. Its voice was flat, empty of emotion, carrying no more inflection than a door closing. This territory was abandoned. The undead here operated without coordination. Resources were being wasted. I corrected these inefficiencies. The Witch King felt something that might have been anger if he had retained the capacity for such clean emotions. Those were my inefficiencies. That was my territory. You are a tool of another entity. The armored figure interrupted the words, delivered without emphasis, but with complete finality. You possess no independent authority. Your claim derives from delegation, not ownership. I recognize no such delegated claims. The Witch King stepped forward, his form seeming to grow larger, darker, more terrible. The black breath that preceded him in battle began to fill the chamber, a miasma of despair and dissolution that had broken the will of kings and made heroes weep for the mercy of death. The armored figure tilted its head slightly, as though noting an interesting but minor phenomenon. Then it raised one gauntleted hand, palm forward. The black breath dissipated, not pushed back, not overwhelmed by greater force, but simply negated as though someone had reached out and turned a valve to shut off its flow. The Witch King found himself unable to manifest the aura that had been his primary weapon for millennia, unable to project the terror that was his very essence. Your methods rely on emotional manipulation. The armored figure observed its tone suggesting neither judgment nor approval, only categorization. This is inefficient. Fear is temporary. Compliance through fear requires constant reinforcement. Superior alternatives exist. The Witch King did not retreat. Retreat was not in his nature, but for the first time in ages, beyond counting, he experienced something that resembled uncertainty. He had faced heroes and their holy weapons. He had weathered the power of ancient artifacts and the wrath of beings far older than himself. But this was different. This was not being attacked. This was being analyzed and found wanting. "I am the Lord of the Nazgul," he said, and his voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. "I am the breaker of kingdoms, You are a component in another system," the armored figure said, cutting off the litany. "As are the structures you built here. I have incorporated these structures into a more efficient framework. Your presence is noted, but not required." The Witch King stood silent for a moment that stretched longer than he intended. Then slowly he stepped back. Not fleeing, he would not grant this entity that satisfaction, but withdrawing, acknowledging implicitly what he would never state aloud, that this was not a conflict he could win through the methods available to him. "My master will hear of this," he said, and the words tasted like ash, even though he had no tongue to taste with. "I have already communicated with your master," the armored figure replied. "Your master is patient. Your master understands long-term strategy. Your master has chosen not to engage at this time. You should reflect on why that choice was made." The Witch King departed, mounting his fell beast and rising into the sky with more haste than dignity. As he flew south back toward the dubious sanctuary of Morgul, he felt something he had not experienced since the day Sauron first bound him with the ring. He felt small. Behind him in the Ice Citadel, the Lich King returned his attention to the network that spread across the Northlands. The interruption had been minor, easily addressed. The entity that styled itself Lord of the Nazgul was powerful by the standards of this world, certainly, but power without understanding was merely force applied randomly. The Lich King understood. And understanding properly applied rendered force itself obsolete. The work continued methodical and unceasing as the dead of Middle-earth learned what it meant to serve a will that had no capacity for doubt and no interest in their terror. The confrontation between the Witch King and the Lich King had been observed. Not by mortal eyes, for no mortal remained in those frozen wastes to witness what transpired. But Sauron had watched through the bonds that connected him to his greatest servant, and what he had seen required recalculation. The entity in the north had dismissed the Witch King as though he were a minor functionary, rather than the breaker of kingdoms, the terror that had ended Arnor and made even the bravest warriors quail. It had negated powers that had been perfected over millennia with the same casual efficiency one might show in closing a door. And most troubling of all, it had done so without expending noticeable effort, without revealing the full extent of its capabilities. This suggested reserves of power that went far deeper than what had been displayed. It suggested expertise that came not from long study of this world's principles, but from mastery achieved elsewhere, and now being applied here with the confidence of proven methodology. And it suggested that direct confrontation between powers of such magnitude would not follow the patterns that Sauron had spent 3,000 years learning to exploit. The Dark Lord's attention turned to the network of Nazgul that served as his primary instruments of terror and control. The Nine had been his most successful creation. Kings and sorcerers corrupted through their own desires, bound through oaths that transcended death, reduced to hollow servants who could neither die nor disobey. They were perfect tools, or had been until something had demonstrated they could be analyzed, tested, and potentially claimed by authority other than his own. One of the Nine, not the Witch King, but a lesser wraith whose name had been lost to time, circled the edges of the frozen territories on patrol. Sauron observed through its eyes, using it as a probe to measure the extent of the changes that had swept across the north. And as he observed, he calculated. The entity would act again. It had demonstrated its methods clearly enough. Direct seizure, systematic conversion, the establishment of infrastructure without regard for existing claims of dominion. It would attempt to claim another Nazgul, not the Witch King perhaps, but one of the lesser servants, if only to prove that it could, to demonstrate that even Sauron's most sophisticated creations were vulnerable to its methods. Sauron would allow this, not because he lacked the power to prevent it, but because prevention would teach him nothing about the true extent of the entity's capabilities. But he would not allow it to succeed completely. He would contest the claim not to win in the traditional sense, but to force the entity to reveal how it responded when its methods encountered resistance equal to its strength. The trap was set. The bait was offered. Now Sauron waited to see what could be learned from the inevitable clash. The Lich King was aware of the Nazgul circling at the edge of his territory. He had been aware since the moment it entered the range of his network, its presence registering through the web of undead that now stretched across the northern lands. He had observed it for 3 days, noting its patterns, measuring its responses, analyzing the structure of its binding to the entity in Barad-dûr. It was not bait. Or rather, it was not merely bait. It was an invitation, a challenge. The entity in the east was offering him an opportunity to demonstrate his methods, to reveal the full extent of how he claimed what he desired. And in accepting the invitation, he would reveal that information. But revelation worked both ways. If he could force the entity to contest the claim with full strength, he would learn the mechanisms by which it maintained control. He would understand the architecture of the bindings it employed. And understanding that architecture would allow him to identify its vulnerabilities. The Lich King rose from his throne. This required precision beyond what remote operation could provide. This required direct engagement, full commitment of his capabilities, the complete application of force that he had thus far kept in reserve. Frostmourne sang in its sheath, responding to his intention, eager for the work that was to come. He stepped from the citadel onto the frozen plain, and with each step, the temperature dropped further. The ice beneath his feet cracked and reformed in patterns that spread outward like cracks in glass, each line connecting to the nodes of his network and amplifying the signal of his will. By the time he had walked 100 paces, the entire northern territory had become an extension of his presence. Every undead, simultaneously aware of his focus, every claimed essence oriented toward the single purpose he now pursued. The Nazgul, still circling high above, felt the change immediately. Where before it had been observing a territory that was organized but essentially static, now it perceived something that resembled a vast mechanism coming to full operational capacity. The dead below stopped their coordinated movements and stood perfectly still, becoming not individual units, but components of a single unified consciousness. And that consciousness reached upward. Frostmourne left its sheath with a sound like ice cracking under immense pressure. The Lich King did not point the blade at the distant wraith. He did not need to. The sword's nature resonated with his will. And through that resonance, he extended a pull that bypassed distance and physical limitation. This was not an attack in the traditional sense. It was a claim, an assertion, a statement that the essence within that distant form now belonged to him because he had decided it did. The Nazgul screamed, though it had no throat to scream with. The pull was immediate, invasive, absolute. Where before, when Frostmourne had touched one of the 9, the claim had been tentative testing. This was total commitment. The Lich King was not examining the binding. He was severing it. In Barad-dûr, Sauron felt the assault like a blade driven into his own essence. The bond between himself and the Nazgul pulled taut, stretching under forces it had never been designed to withstand. For 3,000 years, that bond had been unbreakable, reinforced by oaths and corruption and the slow accumulation of dependence that made the wraith's very existence contingent upon its connection to its master. Now that bond was being cut. Sauron pulled back, not with the gradual pressure he had applied before, but with the full weight of 3 millennia of patient construction. The one ring upon his finger pulsed with power that had been woven into the foundations of reality itself when the world was young. Through the ring flowed authority over the 9, and through the 9 authority over the wraith that was being claimed. That authority now manifested as a chain forged from the fundamental nature of oaths and binding a force that said, This belongs to me, has always belonged to me, will always belong to me. The Nazgul hung suspended between two absolute assertions of ownership. Its essence, already hollowed out by millennia of servitude, began to tear under the strain. This was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no weapons clashing, no forces visibly contesting, but in the realm where will itself was made manifest. Where consciousness touched consciousness, and authority was measured against authority, two powers of terrible magnitude were each insisting that the same resource could not possibly belong to the other. Frostmourne pulled. The blade's hunger was not for blood or death, but for essence itself, and it had found essence of remarkable quality. The sword sought to extract what it claimed to draw the Wraith's identity through the connection that the Lich King maintained with perfect clarity, despite the distance and despite the resistance. The One Ring pulled. The artifact's power was not hunger, but ownership, the absolute conviction that what had been bound by its maker could never be unbound by another. Through the ring flowed Sauron's will, patient and unyielding, backed by knowledge that predated the sun and moon, by expertise in domination that had toppled kingdoms and broken wills across 3 ages of the world. Between these two forces, the Nazgul existed in a state of impossible contradiction. Its essence was simultaneously being extracted and held claimed and retained, severed and reinforced. The bindings that had made it what it was began to fracture under pressures they had never been designed to withstand, not breaking cleanly, but tearing in ways that left fragments scattered across multiple states of being. The Lich King felt resistance beyond what he had anticipated. He had expected strength. The entity in the east was clearly powerful, clearly sophisticated. But this went beyond strength. This was structure so deeply embedded in the nature of the Wraith that removing it was like trying to extract a skeleton from living flesh. The binding between master and servant was not merely control. It was identity itself, rebuilt and reinforced until the line between who commanded and who obeyed had ceased to have meaning. Impressive. Sauron felt the claim progressing despite his resistance. The entity was not simply pulling harder. It was identifying the specific threads that held the binding together and cutting them with surgical precision, working around his defenses, rather than attempting to overwhelm them through force. This was not the blunt application of power. This was technique refined through repetition until it had become nearly automatic. Also impressive. For 17 seconds, the contest continued. Neither side yielded. Neither side could yield without admitting that their claim was subordinate to the other's authority. But neither could maintain the level of force being applied indefinitely without risking consequences beyond the simple loss of a single servant. And then simultaneously, both powers made the same calculation. The cost of victory exceeds the value of the prize. Frostmourne released its claim, not completely, not surrendering what it had already grasped, but ceasing to pull for more. The One Ring eased its pull, not relinquishing what it held, not accepting loss, but acknowledging that the contested resource was no longer whole enough to be worth the expenditure of maximum force. The Nazgul fell. It did not fall to earth, for it was not a physical entity that could be measured by altitude. It fell through states of being, through layers of existence, until it finally settled into something that was neither fully claimed nor fully retained. Half of its essence remained bound to Sauron through the ring, the oaths, and corruption, still holding despite the damage. Half had been extracted by Frostmourne and now existed in a state of liminal suspension, neither fully incorporated into the Lich King's network nor truly separate from it. What remained was a wraith that existed in two states simultaneously, When Sauron called, it responded, but sluggishly with hesitation, as though the command had to travel through interference to reach what was left of its identity. When the Lich King exerted his will, it reacted, but incompletely, with parts of its essence failing to comply, because those parts remained bound elsewhere. It was broken. Not destroyed, but fractured in ways that rendered it unreliable to either power. A tool that had been pulled apart by competing forces and could no longer function as designed. The glitched wraith descended into the valley between Angmar and Mordor, moving with jerking, uncoordinated movements that suggested damage to its fundamental nature. One side of its form flickered with the pale blue light of frost ice, crystallizing along the tattered robes. The other side remained wreathed in the oily darkness of Morgul. The corruption that Sauron had instilled, still present but no longer fully integrated with the rest of its being. It landed on barren ground and knelt, though whether the gesture was directed toward Barad-dûr or Carn Dûm could not be determined. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. The wraith had become a thing caught between two absolute authorities, belonging fully to neither, and in that liminal state it had lost the capacity for true allegiance. In the Ice Citadel, the Lich King observed the result of the contest with satisfaction that was purely analytical. He had not claimed the wraith completely, but he had proven that even Sauron's most sophisticated bindings could be damaged. He had forced the entity in the east to reveal the full extent of its ability to maintain control under maximum pressure. And most importantly, he had demonstrated that ownership was not absolute when two powers of sufficient magnitude both asserted claims. The information gained was worth the incomplete victory. In Barad-dûr, Sauron contemplated the fractured servant with patience that came from having weathered defeats before and learned from each one. He had not lost the Nazgûl completely, but neither had he maintained full dominion. The entity in the north was powerful enough to contest even the bindings created through the Rings of Power. That knowledge required adjustment of strategy, recalculation of what could be achieved through direct confrontation versus what must be accomplished through other means. But there was also opportunity in the outcome. The free peoples of Middle-earth would see the glitched wraith and understand that the power in the north was not invincible. They would witness the evidence of a contest between two shadows, and in witnessing it, they would realize that the threats they faced were actively opposed to each other. Division among enemies created opportunities for those who knew how to exploit such divisions. The game continued. The pieces had been tested, and the board itself had changed in ways that would only become clear as further moves were made. In Rivendell, Gandalf received word of the phenomenon from rangers who had witnessed the wraith's descent. He listened to their descriptions, the flickering form, the jerking movements, the sense of a thing caught between two states, and felt a chill that went beyond any mere drop in temperature. "They have begun to truly contest each other," he said quietly to Elrond. "Not merely testing boundaries, but actively attempting to seize what the other claims." "And neither succeeded completely," Elrond observed. "No," Gandalf agreed. "But both proved they could damage what the other builds, which means the contest will escalate. Each will seek to demonstrate superiority to prove that their method of control is more absolute than their rivals. And in that escalation..." He did not finish the sentence. Both understood what went unsaid. In that escalation, the living would become the material with which both sides measured their strength. The glitched wraith was merely the first example of what happened when absolute powers contested ownership. It would not be the last. The wraith knelt in the valley for 3 days without moving. It did not need to move. Movement was a function of will, and will was the one thing it no longer possessed in any coherent form. The fragment of its essence that remained bound to Sauron pulled it toward obedience to commands that came from Barad-dûr. But those commands arrived distorted, filtered through damage that had never been part of the original binding. The portion that had been claimed by Frostmourne responded to the network of undead that stretched across the north. But that response was incomplete, as though parts of its consciousness simply failed to acknowledge the directives it received. It existed in a state that had no precedent in the long history of Middle-earth. The Nazgûl had been created as absolute servants, their wills so thoroughly subsumed that the concept of divided loyalty was meaningless. But this glitched remnant of what had been a perfect tool, could no longer serve perfectly because it could no longer exist as a unified entity. On the fourth day, the Lich King issued a command through the network. The Wraith stood its movements jerky and uncoordinated and began to walk north. Not smoothly as the other Nazgûl moved, but with a gait that suggested fundamental damage to whatever animated it. Each step was a small war between competing directives, and each war resulted in motion that satisfied neither set of instructions completely. The Lich King observed this and found it acceptable. The Wraith was no longer a reliable tool in the traditional sense, but tools could serve multiple functions if their limitations were understood and accommodated. This particular tool would serve as proof of concept, as demonstration, as evidence that even the most sophisticated bindings could be compromised when subjected to sufficient force applied with adequate precision. But more importantly, it would serve as a map. The damage that had been inflicted revealed the architecture of Sauron's binding method with perfect clarity. Every fractured connection, every severed thread, every point where the ring's authority still held despite the trauma, all of this was information that could be analyzed, cataloged, and eventually exploited. The glitched Wraith was not a victory in itself. It was intelligence walking and visible, demonstrating in real time how the entity in the East maintained control and where that control was vulnerable. The Wraith reached the edge of the network's influence and stopped. The Lich King directed it to remain there, positioned at the boundary between his territory and the lands that Sauron still held unchallenged. A marker, a statement. And though the free peoples would not understand this, a promise of further action when the proper moment arrived. In Barad-dûr, Sauron contemplated the glitched servant through the diminished connection that remained. The Wraith was still bound to him. The oaths held, the corruption remained embedded in what was left of its identity. But the binding had been damaged in ways that rendered it unreliable for the purposes he had originally intended. It could not be trusted with missions that required absolute obedience. It could not serve as instrument of terror when its own nature was now visibly fractured. But damage Sauron had learned across 3 ages of planning and patience could be repurposed. What appeared to be loss could be transformed into advantage if viewed from the correct angle. The glitched Wraith was proof that the entity in the north was powerful enough to contest even the rings of power. This was troubling, but it was also useful information for the free peoples to possess. The Dark Lord's will extended outward through channels that were more subtle than the bonds he used to control his Nazgûl. Whispers in the night. Dreams that carried suggestion rather than command. Information passed through intermediaries who did not know they served him. By these means, word would spread that the two shadows now fought each other, that the power in the north had wounded one of Sauron's greatest servants, that the conflict between them was real and not merely strategic maneuvering. This would do several things. It would give hope to those who opposed him, false hope, but hope nonetheless, and hope made people careless. It would draw attention northward, away from his true preparations in Mordor. And most importantly, it would position the entity in the north as a threat comparable to himself, which meant that any resources expended against that threat were resources not being used to oppose his own plans. The entity was powerful. The entity was efficient. The entity clearly possessed expertise that had been refined elsewhere before being applied here. But the entity also acted directly, obviously, in ways that could be observed and countered. It built infrastructure that was visible. It transformed territories in manners that could not be hidden. It operated, in short, without the patience that came from having 3,000 years to perfect the art of corruption. Sauron would not confront it again directly. Not yet. Instead, he would allow it to expand, to demonstrate its methods, to draw the attention and resistance of every force in Middle-earth that still clung to hope. And while all eyes turned north to watch the frozen citadels rise and the dead march in formation, the true work would continue in Mordor. Quiet, methodical, unstoppable. The glitched wraith was a price paid. But the intelligence gained, the strategic position achieved, and the misdirection accomplished made it a price worth paying. Sauron had sacrificed pawns before to gain position. He would do so again. The game was long, and he had already waited longer than the lifespan of nations. He could wait a while more. At the borders of the territory now claimed by the Lich King, the Rangers of Ithilien established a new outpost. They built it on ground that was still warm at the edge of the frozen zone, and they manned it in shifts to ensure that eyes remained fixed on the phenomena occurring to the north. Their orders were clear: observe, record, report. Under no circumstances were they to engage with the undead that moved through those frozen lands, nor with the wraith that stood at the boundary like a monument to something that should not have been possible. Mablung, who had observed the transformation of the dead marshes and carried that memory like a weight upon his shoulders, was among those assigned to the new post. He spent hours watching the glitched wraith through a distance glass, noting the way it flickered between states, the manner in which frost and darkness warred across its form. It disturbed him in ways that went beyond the traditional fear of undead or wraiths. "It's broken," he said to his companion one evening as the sun set and the wraith became more visible in the growing darkness. Not destroyed. Broken. Like a tool that's been used beyond its capacity and can no longer function properly. "Is that better or worse than if it were whole?" the other ranger asked. Mablung considered this. "Worse," he said finally, "because it proves they can be damaged. And if they can be damaged, they can be fought over. And if they're fought over, we're the territory where the fighting happens." Word of the glitched wraith spread through the networks of communication that linked the free peoples. From Minas Tirith to Rivendell, from the Shire to the halls of Erebor, the message traveled. The two shadows now contested each other openly, and the result was a thing that belonged fully to neither, but could be claimed by both. Reactions varied. Some saw hope in the division of their enemies. Others saw only the promise of greater devastation when powers of such magnitude clashed without regard for who stood between them. In Rivendell, Elrond convened a council that included Gandalf and representatives from the few realms that still maintained the strength to resist what was coming. The topic was not what to do about Sauron. That strategy had been debated for years and remained largely unchanged. The topic was how to respond to the emergence of a second power that treated death itself as raw material. Gandalf stood before the assembled lords and captains, his face grave beneath his pointed hat, and delivered an assessment that he had spent days refining, but still felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what they faced. "We have spent an age preparing to fight one enemy," he began. "We have studied Sauron's methods. We understand how he corrupts, how he builds his power through the slow binding of wills. We know that he is patient, that he plans across centuries, that he will not move until every piece is in position. This knowledge has shaped our response. We have fortified borders, gathered alliances, sought artifacts that might tip the balance in the final confrontation. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces of those assembled. But now we face something else. Not instead of Sauron, but in addition to him. A power that does not corrupt, but converts. That does not plan across centuries, but acts within days. That treats death not as an ending to be feared, but as a resource to be optimized. Elrond spoke into the silence that followed. What do you counsel, Mithrandir? I counsel that we do not choose between them, Gandalf said. I counsel that we remember both our enemies, regardless of whether they oppose each other. The fact that two wolves fight over territory does not make either of them friends to the sheep who graze in that territory. But surely, one of the captains from Gondor ventured, if they weaken each other, they will not weaken each other. Gandalf interrupted, his voice sharp. They will test each other. They will contest boundaries and demonstrate methods. And in doing so, they will learn. Sauron will learn how the Northern Power operates and will adapt his strategies accordingly. The Northern Power will learn the limits of Sauron's bindings and will refine its own techniques. The conflict between them is not a war of attrition. It is a mutual education in the art of dominion. He moved to the map that had been laid out on the central table, his finger tracing the lines that marked territories and boundaries. And while they educate each other, the living diminish. Resources are spent watching two fronts. Attention is divided between threats that require completely different responses. And every soul that falls in the contested land becomes material for whichever power reaches it first. What would you have us do? Elrond asked quietly. Gandalf straightened his hand, falling away from the map. Survive, he said simply. Hold what can be held. Preserve what can be preserved. And pray that when the final reckoning comes, and it will come, make no mistake. We have not been so reduced by watching two shadows that we lack the strength to resist whichever one proves dominant. The council continued for hours, after that debating strategies and allocating resources. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Middle-earth now cast two shadows, and the living existed in the narrow space between them. What that space would look like when both shadows had finished expanding was a question no one could answer with any certainty. In the ice citadel of Carn Dûm, the Lich King sat upon his throne and extended his consciousness through the network that now stretched from Angmar to the borders of Mordor. The glitched wraith stood at the boundary, serving its function as marker and map. The dead marshes operated with perfect efficiency, processing essence and extending his reach into territories that should have been beyond his grasp, given the distances involved. The undead throughout the north moved with coordination that would have been impossible for living armies to achieve. The infrastructure was established. The proof of concept was complete. The entity in the east had been forced to reveal the mechanisms by which it maintained control. And those mechanisms, sophisticated though they were, had proven vulnerable to direct severance when sufficient force was applied with adequate precision. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 would require patience of a different sort than Sauron's. Not the patience of ages, but the patience of watching a complex system reach optimal operational capacity before committing it to its intended purpose. The network was built. Now it needed to be refined, expanded, integrated into a form that could serve functions beyond mere control of territory. The dead of Middle-earth had been organized. Soon they would learn what organized death could accomplish when directed by a will that understood efficiency not as an abstract concept, but as an absolute imperative. The glitched wraith stood at the boundary between two powers, belonging fully to neither claimed by both. Ice crystallized on one side of its tattered form. Darkness clung to the other. It did not think thought required coherence it no longer possessed. It did not feel emotion required unity it had lost. It simply existed, a monument to the moment when two absolute authorities had contested ownership, and neither had achieved complete victory. Behind it to the north, the frozen land stretched in geometric perfection, every element positioned according to specifications that prioritized function over all other considerations. Ahead to the south, the territories held by older powers spread in patterns that had been refined across ages. Corruption layered upon corruption until the distinction between master and servant had ceased to have meaning. Between these two dominions, the free peoples of Middle-earth held what ground they could and prepared for conflicts they could not fully comprehend. They did not know that they were watching the opening moves of a contest that would define the nature of death itself. They did not understand that the war they had feared was no longer the war they faced. But they would learn. Middle-earth was a harsh teacher, and the lessons it had to impart in the days to come would be written in ice and darkness, in systems and corruption, in the slow realization that some conflicts had no victors, only survivors, and those who were not fortunate enough to number among them. The glitched wraith stood watch. The two powers observed each other across the distance that separated their seats of authority. And in that observation, in that careful measurement of strength against strength and method against method, the future of Middle-earth hung balanced between two equally terrible possibilities. Which shadow would ultimately prevail was a question that even the wisest could not answer. But that both shadows would grow, would expand, would contest every soul and every territory, until one or both had reshaped the world according to their design that was no longer a question at all. That was a certainty. And certainty in such matters was the coldest comfort of all.